When you're out on the river and you're struggling to catch fish, how often have you looked at other anglers who are putting fish in the net and wondered what fly they're using? I used to have this question all the time, and I'd ask random anglers what fly they were using. Sometimes they'd have a spare for me to use, and I'd get all excited thinking that I'd cracked the code. Usually, though, I just went right back to not catching any fish. That's because I didn't understand that the right fly pattern doesn't make a hill of beans difference if you're not fishing it correctly. And this week on Untangled, I'm going to show you why that might be the most important lesson I've learned in over 2 decades of fly fishing. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant, having more fun than a human being ought to be allowed, but someone's got to do it. Someone's got to be here and talk shop every week, and yeah, I'm just glad I'm the one that gets to do it. So seriously, all kidding aside, thank you all for listening to the show every week, watching. If you watch it on YouTube, it's great to be able to do this. We're coming up on almost 3 years of Untangled. It'll be 3 years in December. I forget the exact date, but it's kind of crazy to see the growth of the show and that I'm still doing it 3 years later. That's really cool. And obviously that ain't possible without y'all. So thank you very much for the support over the years, and hopefully we get to keep doing it for at least another 3 years, if not another 3 decades. Yeah, at that point, I might end up with some silver in my beard at that point. We'll have to change the nickname to Silverbeard. I wouldn't mind that, to be completely honest. It'll make me look distinguished. I'll finally look like I know what I'm talking about. Oh, anyways, I'm stoked for the show this week because I get to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and this skill in particular is something that I made a personal goal to work on in 2025. And what this can really be boiled down to, obviously, you saw the title of the show, we had the hook, but what we can really boil this all down to is the fact that at the end of the day, the fly pattern you pick really doesn't matter nearly as much as how you fish that fly. Now, I'm not saying that fly pattern and fly selection doesn't matter, because it does. We spend a lot of time on the show talking about the importance of fly selection. And obviously, if you throw a grasshopper during a mayfly hatch, it's not really going to work out too well. You could fish that grasshopper perfectly, but it's a mayfly hatch. The grasshopper does not look anything like a mayfly. It's probably not going to work out well for you if you do that. But on the flip side, there are some rare circumstances where you are going to need that carbon copy of the real life bug that's on the water at that point, because the fish are being that picky. And that's a very rare case though. So most of the time, the fly pattern you pick is not nearly as important. So long as it's close enough to what's on the water, if you fish it well, you're going to have a lot of success. Now, I'm going to tell you all a story just to illustrate this point. It was years ago. I was out in Oregon with my 2 good buddies, Ryan McCullough and Mike Kingsbury. 3 of us were out fishing together. And we're on this river that's got a reputation for real picky brown trout. That they can infuriate you because the water moves very slow through the whole river. It's crystal clear, and even when the flows are up in the summer, it's pretty low. So they've got a lot of time to sit there and inspect your flies, and they'll tell, oh, he used 6X tippet. I'm not going to bite that. He needs to use 7 instead. They're that persnickety about it. They're like the first time your mother-in-law comes over to your house when you bought your own house, and she runs her finger along the coffee table and it's dusty, or there's one dish in the sink and she just gives you, that little sniff of, well, that's not how I do it in my place. Just that little passive aggressive stab of just, you're not good enough. Yeah, I know I'm not good enough for your daughter, but I'm trying, dadgummit. That's what these fish are masters of in this river. Just that, you're not good enough. And then you sit there trying to figure out how to get good enough. But anyways, it's a great time to be on the water. We were out there right at the beginning of the blue-winged olive hatch, the blue-winged olive mayflies. And right about noon, right on schedule, this hatch starts coming off, and it's just ridiculous. It's one of those hatches that they write ballads about. If we were still the kind of society that had traveling bards with their lutes and whatnot, folks would have written ballads. We would have people traveling to little get-togethers of fly anglers singing songs about this hatch. It was that good. There were so many bugs on the water, you could hardly pick out your own. It was tough to see your fake one among all the real ones on the water. And the fish would just come up and just gulp mouthfuls of blue-winged olives. It was really, if you know what you're doing, it was the kind of hatch where you can just clean up, where you can catch a lot of fish, a lot of nice fish, because every fish in the river was looking up. That's how great this hatch was. And Mike and Ryan, they're both better anglers than I am by a good deal. And Ryan was hooking into fish pretty consistently. He was downstream of me. And then Mike was upstream of me. And Mike put us all to shame because he's up there. He fished the same size 18 Griffiths gnat for the entire hatch until it was literally just a little bit of black thread on a hook, and he was still catching fish on it. The fish were just going nuts for that. And Ryan's consistently getting into fish. He's a very match the hatch type angler, so he was having a lot of fun matching exactly, and he was catching tons of fish. And then I'm in the middle of them, and I was switching flies every few casts because I kept not catching fish. And so I assumed, well, I've just got the wrong fly on, even though I had a Griffiths gnat that Mike gave me, and I had some blue-winged duns that Ryan gave me. And I don't know how many times I switched flies, more times than I can count, to be honest. And I think I caught 3 or 4 total during this hatch, and it lasted. It was one of the longest blue-wing hatches I've ever fished. It was probably a good 5 hours that the duns were consistently coming off. It was remarkable to witness. And I think Mike caught more than 20, and most of his fish were close to 20 inches. It was that good of a day on the water, and I caught 3 or 4. And then Ryan caught 10, 12, maybe a few more than that. It was long enough ago that I don't remember exactly how many. I just remember that I got my butt kicked, and the ones that I did catch felt more like luck than actual skill. So that part was really frustrating. And just in case you're not sure what blue-winged olive mayflies are, I'm talking about these hatches, and that stuff's not particularly clear to you. We've actually put together a year-round hatch chart that talks about when these bugs hatch and some good imitations for all the bugs when they come off. So that way you head to the river, you're prepped, you're ready to go. You know what flies you need in your box to match the hatch that might be coming off, so that if you get into a mayfly hatch like Ryan and Mike and I had, you've got the flies that you need to match those hatches. So it's our year-round hatch chart. It's completely free. You can check that out. It's a real helpful guide just to make sure you're prepped whenever you head out to the water. I'll throw a link to that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. It can be helpful. But this trip, this was the first time that I really remember this principle of pattern or presentation over pattern. That principle really stuck in my head because Mike and I actually drove home from Oregon to Utah that night. It was a stupid long drive. I don't know why we did that. We should have just slept and then gone home in the morning. But we had a lot of time to chat. We had a lot of time to talk about the day. And I kept asking him, why'd you use that size 18 Griffiths gnat? Why didn't you use this hatch matcher blue-winged olive? Or why didn't you use this cripple? Or why didn't you use this sparkle dun? And he said something to the effect of, well, the gnat was small and the bugs were small and the fish really didn't seem to care. Which made me go quiet just like that for a minute. I just looked at him and it was the most laid back sort of blue collar approach to a hatch that I'd never considered before, but there was nothing I could point to, especially given his success, as being quote unquote wrong. There was nothing that I could say, well, you're doing that wrong. It was just, oh, okay. Meanwhile, I'd had a really tough go of it because my supposedly perfect imitations that I kept throwing were getting ignored. And what it really boiled down to, and it hit me somewhere on that drive, that I wasn't presenting those flies nearly as well as Mike did. So it goes back to what I say all the time on this show. You've got to put your flies in front of fish. You got to make them look real. That's your job as a fly angler. I wasn't making my flies look real. Mike was, and that made all the difference in the catching. And in a lot of situations, that's really what your success as an angler is going to come down to. Fish are going to eat your flies if they look real, probably 95% of the time. There will be those random fish that just say, no, it's got to be perfect or I ain't eating it. And that's when you need to be able to dive into a box of a lot of patterns and sort through things and match different stages of the hatch. So that's still very important. But a lot of times, if you just fish it well and make it look real, you're going to catch fish. Okay. And that's why we'll get a lot of questions here into Untangled or posting in our school group where folks will ask questions like, what flies should I use for brown trout in this river? Or what flies should I use at this lake, in this state, at this time of day? And I'll get those questions and I rarely give them a straight answer. And it's not because I'm trying to be difficult. I'm not trying to be that guy. And I'm also not trying to say, well, I figured it out on my own. You should figure it out on your own too, you little whippersnapper. First off, I'm still probably a whippersnapper to most of these folks. And then there's merit to figuring it out on your own. But my whole point is those are the wrong questions to ask. And I want to help people avoid the trap that I fell into for probably a good 5 or 6 years when I really started fly fishing, which is that I worried so much about fly pattern. I would have these same questions where I was so concerned that I did not have the right pattern that I probably had 1,000 flies with me in my vest at any given time when I was on the water. And my vest was just stuffed full, like my face at Thanksgiving. It was just overflowing with fly boxes, but I always felt like I never had the right fly because I'd go out and I'd try to fish and I'd put these flies out there and I thought I was making them look real and they just kept getting ignored and ignored and ignored, especially my dry fly fishing. And it was maddening because I'd go home and I'd look up new patterns and I'd spend hours at the vise and I feel like I grew up in Utah and when I really got into fly fishing, I was living near fly fish food in Orem. And I feel like I kept them in business for a good chunk of the years because I was buying so much fly tying stuff. And this was well before VFC was ever even a thought in the minds of us here. So I'd spend all this time and all this money and effort tying, and I'd go out and I'd think, I've got the fly pattern, and it was the same result time after time after time. And you can skip that entire frustrating experience. That's why I don't give those straight answers to, well, what fly should I use? I say, well, it's not about what fly you should use. It's about what bugs are active, what can you use to imitate that, and can you make it look real? That's what you should be asking yourself. Because if you understand the simple truth that presentation matters way more than pattern, you're going to skip that and you're going to level up way quicker than I ever did. You skip a lot of those frustrating days. You'll save yourself a little bit of change on tying or buying bajillions of flies to match all these different hatches. And I got one more example just to drive this point home a little bit further. A few weeks ago, Alex and I were out on the Green River with our good friend Ryan Kelly. He's Green River Fly Fisher on Instagram. The Green in Utah is one of the world's most famous fisheries. It is extremely pressured. It gets tons of angler days every single year. And those trout have seen everything. They have seen it all. They've got PhDs in fly design. And they'll reject your blue-winged olive mayflies if you use the wrong shade of Baetis olive dubbing for or the wrong shade of thread. Okay, not really. It feels that way sometimes, but usually they're not that picky. They can be, but we get to the river and Ryan says, I think you should throw this black cricket. And it was the day before Halloween that we were fishing. And I just looked at him weird because terrestrial season's been well over in my neck of the woods. I live a lot further north now. So I haven't fished terrestrial since September because they've just been off the menu up here. And I said, okay, I'm not going to question Ryan. He knows the river way better than I ever will. So I tied on, and Ryan and Alex switched off nymphing and chucking streamers. And I threw a nymph for a little bit too, but I fished that black cricket for most of the day. And I caught a ton of fish on it. I caught enough that Alex decided he was ditching the dry dropper rig and going single dry fly. Now you might think, well, he was just going to switch over to a black cricket, just like me. But Alex kind of likes to do and try different things when we're out on the water. He likes to see, what will the fish actually eat. So instead of tying on a black cricket like I was fishing, he pulls out a parachute Adams. And I was on the oars at the minute. Ryan was in the front of the boat fishing a streamer. Alex is in the back of the boat with his parachute Adams. And unlike his second or third cast, Alex hooks into a fish that ate the parachute Adams. And Ryan hooks into a fish on a streamer, and they doubled up. And it was like the third double that they'd had while I was rowing that day. It was really remarkable. And then again, I'd been fishing that same black cricket all day too. And then right there when I'm rowing, Alex and Ryan catch two fish on wildly different flies. And then later on, Alex ended up tying on a dry dropper rig again, and he caught another fish on a Spanish bullet on a dry dropper rig. So at that point, we've got fish caught on black crickets, parachute Adams, Spanish bullets. I think he even caught one on the Royal Flush, one of Ryan's nymphs, and then a few different streamer patterns. So that's half a dozen different flies that we were catching fish on that day. So how much does the pattern really matter? Even on a fishery as pressured and as tough to get to as the green, how much did pattern matter that day? Not really a whole lot, at least not on that day. It really didn't matter. Presentation mattered way more that day than the fly. As long as we got a fly in front of a fish and it looked real, they were willing to come play. And that's my experience, like I said, probably 95% of the time. When they get keyed in on a midge or a mayfly hatch or even a caddis hatch, fish will get really picky. That's when you've got to bust out your skills. But if there's not a huge hatch going on, and it's just kind of one of those ho-hum days on the river, that there's a lot more of those than there are of crazy hatches that we write stories and songs about. If you get a fly in front of a fish, make it look real, fish are going to reward you more often than not. All right, we got one more story, and I promise we're going to get to some actionable tips here in a minute, so bear with me. But I got one more story just to drive home the presentation side of this, right? It was about a month and a half ago. Alex and I, we were out fishing in our boat. We were getting some rowing practice in for Alex. He's starting to get really good on the oars, too. If you run into Alex, tell him good job rowing, and he'll probably look at you kind of weird, but he's doing a great job. We were testing some prototypes for our new fly rods that are coming out. Spoiler alert, we've got new stuff in the works. But we got to this section of the river where the fish were rising pretty consistently. There was a good blue-winged olive hatch happening. So we pulled the boat over to the bank. We re-rigged real quick, and then it was Alex's turn to fish. So I rode him into position below. There were 2 or 3 big fish rising in this tight little trough. So I rode Alex into position, got him right there. The fish doesn't know we're there. Alex makes the first couple of casts, drifts that fly in front of the fish. The fish rises, it opened its mouth, and then at the last second, you could see the fish just turn away from the fly. Something about the fly just didn't feel right to that fish, so it refused it right at the last moment. So Alex thinking, okay, well, maybe there was some micro drag, maybe something was off about my presentation. He made a few more casts over the fish, but the fish would literally let Alex's fly drift over it and then rise immediately after to eat a real one. So the fish knew it was fake. So Alex re-rigs again a little bit. He sizes down to a size 20 emerger and threw on 6X tippet. Throws it out there and first cast with this slightly revised rig. Boom, he puts a stud of a cutthroat in the net. Just a gorgeous cutthroat. And it was just a smaller version of the same fly that he was using, too. He bumped down to a 20. Same pattern, just a little bit smaller. And then 6X tippet from 5X. And boom, as soon as he does that, makes all the difference in the world, puts that fish in the net. So it's my turn. I get to fish next. And the other fish that had been rising in that trough was still rising. So I cast to it. I was real excited. I thought, oh, I've got this. And the same thing happened to me. That fish came up. It rejected my first fly. So I said, okay. I sized down. I made another cast, but I messed that cast up and I landed my fly line right on top of the rising fish and it just quit rising. So I was done. I'd messed it up. My presentation was terrible. And I never got that big one to rise again. It was really kind of heartbreaking, actually, because I was ready to catch a nice fish, and I just didn't pull it off. So you will run into fish like that every now and then, where it's nice to have a variety of patterns and sizes of those patterns on hand. But days like that, those are the exception, really, not the rule. And even then, we didn't make a wholesale change of the fly we were using. It's just a different size of the same patterns and then smaller tippet because we were focusing on the presentation of it less so than the pattern. Okay. That is what you've got to take away from this is that you have got to make sure that you're putting that fly in front of fish. Yes, but you've got to make it look real. So what does that mean? How do we make it look real? What do we do? How do I achieve that? Okay. Without getting too into the weeds, because we can do a whole podcast on that. We've done tons of episodes about presentation, but just to give you some actionable steps to build on here. You want to look out for drag, first and foremost. Is your fly drifting naturally? Is it dragging? That is a huge one. Second thing, make sure that it's sized correctly. Like that last example with me and Alex. Same fly pattern, just sized it down so it was a bit smaller so it more closely matched what was on the water. And then the last thing, are you fishing that fly where it should be? Is that where the fly should be hanging out? If you can do those three things, that's putting flies in front of fish and making them look real. That's bringing both of those two components together. So in case you're not aware, drag. When you throw a fly out there or you throw a strike indicator out there if you're nymphing, if there's a little wake coming off of it, if it looks like it's being pulled against the current, that's drag. That wake behind it's the dead giveaway. That tells you and the fish that that's not natural because nymphs, dry flies, they drift naturally in the current. They move with the current. They're not moving against it. They're moving with it. So if your flies are moving against the current, that is a dead giveaway that they're not real. And a lot of times that is going to make it extremely difficult to catch fish if you've got drag on your rig. So make sure that you are casting, that you're standing in the right place to where your drift happens without any drag. Sometimes that means going down on tippet like Alex and I did because tippet that's a little too thick can cause micro drag on your flies. It's very frustrating, but it happens. Okay. So sizing down tippet sometimes is what you've got to do, but there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to avoid drag. But that is one key thing to do. Avoid drag at all costs with your dries and your nymphs. Second thing, we talk about sizing your flies. That is a huge part of presentation. You want to make sure that whatever fly you pick, because yes, the fly pattern doesn't matter a whole ton if it's not presented well, but the fly that you throw out there needs to be a good size match for what's on the water. That's the most important part of matching the flies in your box to the flies in the water is size. So if you get to the water and there's a bunch of size 20 midges hatching, a size 14 really isn't going to help you because it's so big, the fish are usually going to ignore that. Okay. Match that size. Even if you don't have a pattern that's a great midge pattern, even if it's just a parachute Adams, it's way better to throw that than it is to throw a size 14 Renegade or something like that. That might be a little bit more mid-shaped, but is the wrong size. Okay, get that size right, and that is going to make a huge difference. And then finally, are you fishing it where the fly should be? Or are you drifting that fly where it should be? If you're nymphing, but your nymphs are only in the first 10 inches of water and it's a 3-foot deep run, are you going to catch very many fish? Yeah, probably not. Okay, and if you're fishing dry flies and you throw your dries out into the rapids, is that going to catch very many fish? No, it's not. You want to make sure that you're getting the flies where they need to be in front of fish. With nymphs, that means getting them down deep in the strike zone, usually in the bottom third of the water column. With dry flies, That means landing your dry flies right in the feeding lane of the fish so they don't have to move too far to the left or right to eat. Okay, if you put that fly right in front of where the fish is eating, let it drift a few feet into it, a lot of times fish are just going to come right up and eat it. Again, even if the pattern's not an exact match, if you can put it in the right spot, you get it there with a drag-free drift, and it's a decent size match, a lot of times you're going to see some success. So those are the three big things. Okay, instead of switching out flies, instead of buying every pattern in your local fly store and hoping that you've got the right one, make sure you're drifting the flies you do have without drag. Make sure you got the right size fly on there, and then make sure those flies are in the strike zone, whether that's somewhere on top of the water for dry flies or somewhere under the water for nymphs. You do that stuff, you quit worrying so much about pattern and fishing the flies you do have correctly, and you're going to see some big changes happen. It is going to revolutionize your time out on the water. I promise that much. So that does it for the open of the show this week. If you've got any more questions or comments about anything we just chatted about, pattern over presentation over pattern, definitely drop those. I'd love to hear from you guys. But it is time to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show. Now, every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there is a link to send those questions in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Uzi from New Jersey has our first question, writes in and says, I was at a lake fishing and I noticed some fish rising subsurface. You could just see kind of like a pebble dropping into the lake. I cast them with a rig set up with an indicator, then I continued to fish the lake. I noticed some of the fish jumping out of the water. I'm curious if you see this change in behavior, would you switch your rig up? What's the best way to interpret this change of behavior? Uzi, great question. Thank you for sending it in. When I see fish jumping clean out of the water, they're going full free willy on us in lakes. Usually those are the smaller fish. You don't tend to see the really big ones doing that. And I think they do that because they're like me. Whenever Alex says dinner's on the company tonight, I just get real excited to eat. I'm so excited. Like, oh, I get to stuff a face. And the fish feel that same way. They just go and jump and they're just having fun. No, in all reality, I actually heard once from someone that some fish launch out of the water for bugs like that in lakes because they're eating emergers. As those emergers are actively zooming up to the surface, they're moving up to the surface pretty quick to hatch. And the fish charge up from the bottom. They're trying to ambush the bug from underneath so it can't escape. And their momentum when they eat it just carries these fish up and out of the water. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it sounds right. So I'm going to choose to believe it. That's one of the nice things about fly fishing. You can choose to believe some things where we don't have definitive concrete answers anywhere. So that's kind of nice. But regardless, when I see fish barely rising, they're making just that subtle rise that you observed. You did a great job describing that, by the way. But when I see that, that's a dead giveaway to me that fish are eating emergers, and that's the fly you should focus on using. And for those who have no clue what I'm talking about with emergers and hatching and whatnot, your aquatic insects, they start out life as an egg, and then they hatch out of that egg, and they're swimming around down the bottom as kind of a baby. This is the nymph stage, what we refer to as nymphs. And then when they're ready to grow up, they're ready to move out of mom's basement, they're ready to move to grandma's basement instead, because at least grandma's not always on my case, dadgummit. That's when they become the emerger. Okay, they are in that transition stage between a baby and an adult. They're emerging up out of the water. They're going to become that winged adult that we see buzzing around on the surface. And that's the done stage or the adult stage. And then they'll go off, they'll mate, they'll lay their eggs, and they'll die. So that's your aquatic insect life cycle. So that emerger stage is when they are just coming up to the surface. They're ready to hatch into the winged adult. And we are trying to take advantage of that because they're very vulnerable at that point. They can't escape the fish as easily, and then that movement catches the eye of the fish. They really like that movement, so they'll go and eat those emergers. So if I see fish eating emergers and it's consistently happening across the entire lake, then you bet I'm absolutely changing up my rig. I'm chasing them with an emerger at that point instead. And a good rig for this is going to be your double dry fly rig. You put a larger dry fly up top and then a smaller emerger pattern behind it. And then that bigger dry fly acts like an indicator so that if they eat the emerger, the dry fly will move and you can see it. And then it just helps you see the smaller emerger on the surface too. So it's a very effective way to fish these hatches like that. Another great rig is a short dry dropper rig with like a lightly weighted or even unweighted nymph underneath it. So if we're in a mayfly hatch out on a lake, for example, I'll throw like a size 18 unweighted pheasant tail underneath a size 16 parachute Adams. And I'll only drop it maybe 10 to 12 inches. I want it very shallow in the water column because that's imitating that emerging nymph before it gets to the surface, which again, it's that very vulnerable stage where they can't escape the trout. The trout can come up from underneath and ambush them. It's a really easy meal, so the trout key in on that. And that short dry dropper rig is money. It really is effective on lakes. In fact, Alex and I use that a ton. This spring we were out fishing some lakes, and it was in our How We Fish Lakes video. And you can see Alex using a short dry dropper rig just like that with an unweighted demon midge as his dropper, and he cleaned up. He caught way more fish than I did. So you can go take a look at that video if you want. It's a fun one to watch. So yes, short answer, definitely change your rig up depending on the fish and how they're behaving. That's really a key skill that it takes a little bit of time to hone. It's not always the easiest, but the best anglers I know are the ones who let the fish dictate what they're using. They don't try to force feed the fish the rig that they want to use that day. So take the cues from the fish. If they're doing something, follow those cues, rig up that way, and catch some fish. You'll get a lot more effective. So thanks for sending that question on in. I appreciate it. Eileen from New York has our next question, writes in and says, in your nymphing masterclass, you mentioned using a split shot to get the fly deep enough in faster currents. For me, this is a guaranteed mother of all tangles. What is your opinion of using a sinking line? Thanks as always for everything you do. Eileen, good question, and thank you very much. I appreciate it. Two things here. First off, fishing nymphs with a sinking line really isn't ideal for a couple of reasons. You can't really control the depth that your flies get to with a sinking line because it just sinks and sinks and sinks, and there's nothing to stop it from sinking. Now, you can start stripping that line in once it's gotten to the depth that you want, but it's really hard to tell if it's at that depth because the currents are constantly changing. The river depth itself is changing. So it's just, there's really no way to set and maintain a consistent depth with a sinking line. So that's going to make it difficult. And then if you start stripping the line in, that's adding a ton of unnatural movement to your nymphs, a lot of drag to your nymphs, and you don't want that. We just talked about that in the last segment of the show. That's not a natural drift. You want those nymphs drifting with the current, moving with the current. A little bit of movement, a little bit of a swing at the end of your drift can be good because it mimics the nymphs that are rising up to the surface to emerge. That can be a very effective way to trigger some strikes sometimes, but you want the rest of the drift to be that consistent, good, dead drift that you're getting. So that's a big knock against sinking line for nymphing. And then it's also really tough to feel that subtle bite through sinking lines because they're very heavy. They're not very sensitive. It's very unresponsive, and most fish are going to very softly eat a nymph. That's why we use long, light leaders for our nymph rigs and relatively light, very responsive strike indicators on top of that because we want to see and feel sometimes, but mostly see the fish eating that fly. And if you have no visual representation of it and you're trying to feel that all with a sinking line, that's going to be really tough. There's a reason you see the tight line anglers or the Euro anglers who are out there nymphing with no indicator, but they're using all leader. They're using a very sensitive leader system, 20, 25 foot long piece of monofilament and fluorocarbon, and they're in constant contact with their flies. So they can feel everything that's going on with those flies, and they can feel when to set the hook. They don't need the visual representation as much because they're in contact with those flies. But with the sinking line, you're You're not really in contact with them. So I wouldn't use it for that. Sinking lines are tailor-made for streamers. I know some folks who use them for wet fly fishing, but a lot of the anglers who fish wets that I know personally, they use a lot of just floating lines for wet flies. Honestly, sinking lines really seem to be tailor-made for our streamers. So that's where I would leave them. Now, the second thing here is that I completely understand the issues of getting tangled when you're using split shot. Split shot can be a pain in the butt to cast and just to put on your rig. That's why we recommend split shot is the last resort option for getting your flies deeper. And Alex and I are both big fans of just using heavy flies. Get the heavier patterns, use tungsten beads, maybe have one bigger nymph up top and then a smaller nymph on the bottom, both of them with tungsten beads. Lengthen your leader if you need to, cast further upstream so they have time to drop into that strike zone. That's going to be your best bet, more so than split shot. Just from a presentation standpoint, it's going to be better. But you do run into situations where it's just so deep you need split shot. And at that point, if you're going to add it onto your line, you've got to remember that when you put split shot on your rig, you've added some more weight. And that weight means you're not going to get those same tight, narrow loops that you're going to get if you have just a single dry fly on your line, for example. So your loops during the cast need to open up more, which means your casting stroke has to slow down because you've got all that weight. You need to allow time for that weight to travel and to do it at a wider loop. It's going to make sure that it doesn't get tangled. So if you slow down your casting stroke, it's going to widen those loops up. So what that means is you're going to move the rod from your forward stroke to your back stroke at a slower pace. Not hugely slower, but it will be noticeably slower than if you were fishing a dry fly. And again, slowing down that stroke just opens up those loops, keeps your flies from tangling, and then it ensures that the energy is transferring properly throughout the cast so you can get your flies where you need them to be. So slow your cast down. Next time you're on the water, make it a point, once you put some split shot on your rig, to slow it down. Don't rush your casting motions. Pay attention to the feedback that your rod is giving you, and move the rod once you feel the load come off during each casting stroke. And practice this as much as you can, because that's really going to be the best way to work through those tangles, work through the casting motions that cause tangles, learn how to avoid them. And then if you want some more info on this as well, if you want to see all this in action, not just hear me talk about it, you can go check out episode 5 of our nymphing masterclass. We talk all about this rig and fishing it and dealing with it in that episode. I'll throw a link to that down in the show notes or right here on the screen for those who are watching the video podcast. But thanks so much for that question. Appreciate it. Kyle from Colorado's got our next question, writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. First off, I love the show. I've been a long-time listener, and your tips have really helped me take off into being a more experienced angler. This last weekend, I went out to my favorite river, and the flows were way higher than usual. I was excited at this opportunity, but I spent most of the day wondering if I was even getting deep enough. I tried to keep my first fly around 1.5 times the water's depth below my indicator, but it was hard to tell with the higher flows, and after what seemed like endless adjustments, it felt like I was battling between not catching anything or catching the tree at the bottom of the river. So my question today is, what's a surefire way to know how deep to put your flies when nymphing? Thank you, and tight lines." Kyle, it's a great question. Thank you so much for sending it in. Unfortunately, there really is no surefire way to answer your question, because every river is different. Every river depth is different, even throughout the year. As you've noticed, flows get higher, depth change. Flows get lower, depth change. And your flies are going to vary in their weight too. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. Now, that being said, I do fish a lot of different rivers. I do get the opportunity to travel quite a bit and to fish different areas, places that I've never been to before. So my go-to on a lot of rivers when I'm putting a nymph rig together is I put my strike indicator about 5 or 6 feet above the first fly. That's just my go-to, unless it is obviously very low and it's easy for me to tell how deep it is. In the winter, sometimes the flows will get low enough that it's just really easy to tell the depth of something. But majority of the time, my indicator is 5 to 6 feet above that first fly. And I found that just to be a really good all-around starting depth, because I usually have another fly on there that's about 18 to 24 inches below the first nymph. So I know I'm covering deep. And then as I go throughout the day, I just adjust my depth from there. But I'm fishing a lot of these places enough that I can kind of guess within pretty good closeness where my flies need to be on any given day. That's something that's going to come with time. But all of that being said, you did mention something here that's actually key to learning the right depth. You said you felt like you were stuck between not catching anything or catching the tree at the bottom of the river. Well, dude, catching tree at the bottom of the river, that's a good thing. Actually, it's frustrating because you might lose a fly or snag or whatever, but catching the tree at the bottom, especially in higher water, what that tells you is that you know your flies are down deep. They're down where they need to be. And in higher water, that higher water pushes the fish even deeper. So if you're snagging on the bottom, that means you're down at the bottom, right? That's where you want your nymphs to be. So you're just about at the perfect depth. You need just a little bit of adjustment at this point to dial it in and really start catching fish. So the key when you're getting deep and you're snagging bottom constantly is not to make a huge adjustment, but just to make small adjustments. And Alex is really good at this, and he's got tons of stories about days where he's out in the water and he just makes the tiniest adjustment, like 3 or 4 inches with his indicator, just gets those flies a tiny bit deeper, and it's like magic, like a switch flips, and he's into fish consistently, all because of just that little tiny adjustment. So if you catch that tree 5 drifts in a row, move your indicator down like 6 inches and then start drifting again. And if you can keep catching that tree, move it down another 6 inches. Move it until you're not catching that tree on every single drift. If you're catching the tree on, maybe 1 out of every 10 casts or so, that is a sign that your flies are exactly where they need to be. They're bouncing right along the bottom. You don't want to snag bottom on every cast, but every few casts, snagging bottom, that just tells you your flies are in the strike zone. They're down where they need to be, because again, you got to get them down deep, especially when the water rises, like you've mentioned. Okay, so snagging the bottom, it's part of nymphing. When you're fishing flies that deep, you're going to hook the bottom sometimes, especially because we know we need to get our flies deep. So that's not something that you're doing wrong. That's feedback the river is giving you, and all you've got to do is narrow down your depth at that point with small adjustments so that you're not snagging it every single time. Maybe once out of every 10 drifts or so. That is the sweet spot that tells you you're right where you need to be. So what happens, what it sounds like to me, is you hook that tree and then you overcorrected, and then you were too shallow. So then you overcorrected again and started snagging bottom again. So your adjustments on your depth, without being there with you, it's hard to say for sure, but it sounds like they were just too much. Just focus on smaller adjustments, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can dial in the sweet spot of the strike zone with those smaller adjustments. So I hope that helps. And that wraps up the Q&A section of the show this week. But don't go anywhere, folks, because it is time for this week's Live Real Life Moment. Every week here in Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and picture from someone who's been out on the water living real life. We love to see what y'all are up to, hear about the stories that are going on, and share in your successes and in learning and in just enjoying time out on the water. So if you've got a live real life moment that you'd like to share, you can send those on into us at the link in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Ryan, who writes in and says, "This is the first fish I have ever caught on a fly line. I watched the entire fly fishing masterclass in preparation for a trip with 5 other friends, so I felt that I understood the fundamentals. We got to the river and I observed the bugs in the air, on the water, and under the rocks in the water. I opened my box of flies, your premier collection, and used the right fly formula to pick out a prince nymph to match the size of stoneflies I found under a rock. Then I tied on a black zebra midge to form a double dropper. I cast my line and it floated on downstream. Nothing. My buddies had each caught a fish at this point, so I knew there were fish in the water. I kept casting and remembered presentation and the importance of mending the line. Soon, I cast right on target into the foam, mended the line, and watched it drift right to where I wanted it to. Boom! Fish on! It was a 20-inch rainbow trout, the first fish I've ever caught fly fishing, and the biggest fish of the entire trip. Big thanks to All Adventures Fly Co. I went on to catch many more fish that trip, and I'm excited about the next trip. Well, Ryan, that's amazing. I love it. I love seeing that kind of success right out of the gate. You got a little spoiled with a 20-inch rainbow right off the bat. I haven't even caught a 20-inch rainbow this year. So definite tip of the cap to you, man. That's awesome. But that's what it's all about. That's what living real life's about, right? Just going out there, putting all of this stuff, all this knowledge that we talk about, put it to use, and boom, it all coming together. I love it. Thanks so much for sharing it. And thank you, everybody, as we wrap the show up this week, for being here, for listening and watching to the entire show. That helps us out more than you know. And if you'd like to help us out even more, if you really want to see VFC and Untangled stick around for the long haul, then make sure you tell everybody about us. Spread the word. Send some carrier pigeons with notes to your friends. Send some smoke signals, okay? Tell them about Untangled. Get them watching the show. And make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, because the more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is the goal of everything we're doing here at VFC. So, with that in mind, go out on the water, enjoy yourselves. I know the weather's nice where I am. Fall fishing is on fire right now. So go out, spend some time on the water, and until next week, live real life.